Violence is another essential phenomenon in understanding conflicts. Definition given to violence by WHO is intentional use of force or power or threat against oneself or against a group of people, which is going to result or has highly likelihood of resulting with injury, death, maldevelopment and deprivation. So this definition allows us to have a very comprehensive look at the violence. While there's so many other definitions, mostly by psychologists or sociologists, which we are not going to use in case of our lesson today. So the violence has certain differentiation from aggression, anger, hostility, or competitiveness. Let's look at it. Aggression is also an intention to cause harm to another person who is motivated to avoid that harm. But violence is a type of aggression that results with so much hurt and damage that you need medical care. So in that case, this is the main difference between aggression and violence. While we can also talk about anger and competitiveness, and we can compare them with violence, but they are very different from violence, as they can be very biological and they don't necessarily result with harm to another person. Let's look at the typology and characteristics of violence. The main typology given to violence by the Norwegian theorist John Galtung presents three main types of violence. The first one is direct violence, the second one is structural violence, and the third one is cultural violence. So let's try to understand what does this means. Firstly, the direct violence. Direct violence, as you can understand from its name, is a violence, a physical violence or a sexual violence which directly affects one person with severe harm and damage. So direct violence usually occurs in interpersonal violence or self-directed violence. We will come to that later. What is structural violence? Structural violence represents a systematic way in which a person or a group of people is facing violence by some kind of power relations, by states, for instance, by military groups, or by different kind of big actors. One of the best examples for the structural violence can be violence against marginalized groups by law or by structural policies. And the last one is cultural violence. This is a type of violence which results with direct or structural violence. Cultural violence is a type of violence that is taking its roots from certain culture and social norms. For instance, racism, sexism, or homophobia is a type of cultural violence which comes from cultural roots or some kind of cultural construction, and this can result with severe damage for persons or for the groups, especially vulnerable and marginalized groups. So violence acts can be physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological. And violence can occur in different settings, like schools, at workplace, on a street, at home, or in a big country level. So let's differentiate this categorization of violence in terms of its actors. The first one is self-directed violence. Self-directed violence is the combination of violence where mostly one actor is taking place. As you can see from the name, it's just one self doing violence against his or her own will. So this includes the suicide and self-mutilation or any kind of self-abuse. Self-directed violence, we will come to later about the suicide rates and how it's so much a big global phenomenon nowadays. Interpersonal violence is a second type of categorization which has two main sides. Usually it's one side is a victim and another side is a perpetrator who is causing this violence. In this kind of category of interpersonal violence, there is usually a violence happening at home, usually called domestic violence, which is the main party is intermediate partner, the partner who is causing the violence to his or her partner. Children and women are most vulnerable when it comes to domestic violence. Worldwide, 1 in 3 women face violence once in their lifetime. It's around 35% of the whole population. Community violence also is an interpersonal violence which results with sexual acts, rape, or any kind of psychological harm where several actors take place. Community violence happens in different settings, like in schools, in workplaces, on the streets, and an example for that can be youth violence or child maltreatment, and this violence has a lot of large-scale results and damage to the population. There are an estimated 888,000 suicide deaths worldwide in 2015. This indicates an annual global age standard suicide rate of 10.7 per 1,000 population. Intentional homicide rate is in 2015 is 5.3 per 1,000 population in the world. As you can see, you are more likely to kill yourself than be killed by somebody else. Therefore, mental health is globally alarming and becomes an essential part of the global health. Collective violence is a structural violence which has economic, religious, political or ideological roots. Collective violence is a type of violence which is caused by a group of people or against another group or large population. An example for the collective violence is oppressed policies and against marginalized groups and warfare. War is the most extreme type of collective violence, and throughout the history there have been lots of wars, and war has at some point been understood as a glory and as a self-defense or as a tool to capture and get more territories. While throughout some years the war has taken its the whole ideology to another level, and mostly in the 21st century wars are happening usually on self-defense and on assuring the territorial integrity of the states. But war results with death, maldevelopment and deprivation of lots of people and lots of casualties. One of the recent wars, for example, is the Syrian war, starting in 2011 and had lots of bad outcomes for the population living in Syria. According to the Syrian Center for Policy Research, around 470,000 people died during 2011 and 2016 war in Syria. More than 5 million refugees flee from Syria. 6.3 million IDPs are displaced within the country to seek for a new home.